There is a file inside a government archive in Ottawa that does not officially exist. I know it does not officially exist because I spent the better part of 3 decades trying to confirm that it did, and every single request I made came back with the same response: no records found. But I was in those rooms. I wrote portions of those reports myself. I watched two of the men I worked beside carry what we had documented to their graves without saying a word to anyone, and the third went to his in 2019, which is the reason I am the last one left who can tell you what we found on Baffin Island between 1974 and 1991. 17 years, a classified wildlife assessment program with a budget line buried inside the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development that no one outside a handful of people in Ottawa ever knew existed. And what we were assessing had no scientific classification, no official acknowledgement, and no name in any government document I ever signed. What we were assessing was something that should not have been living on the largest island in the Canadian Arctic, and what we found there changed the way I understand every assumption I ever made about what this planet contains. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. My name is Dale Sproule. I am 79 years old, and I live in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, in the same house I moved into in 1993 when I left federal service for the last time. The house is on a quiet street near the waterfront, and from the back porch you can see the St. Mary's River where it separates Ontario from Michigan, wide and cold and moving with a current that most people in the city have stopped noticing. I have not stopped noticing it. After 17 years in the Arctic, I notice water the way people raised near the sea notice it, as a constant, as the frame that everything else sits inside. I worked for the Canadian government for 21 years, first as a wildlife biologist with the Northern Division of the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, which most people called DIAND, and later in a role that carried no job title on any organizational chart. My education was in wildlife biology at the University of Guelph, class of 1968. I was not an exceptional student in the way that produces academic careers. I was precise, which is different. I wanted to know what was actually there, not what the literature predicted should be there, and that distinction drove me to the field rather than to the library. My thesis work was on the denning distribution of black bears in northern Ontario. 3 winters of trap lines and plaster tracks and photographs taken by tripwire cameras that cost more than my monthly stipend. My faculty supervisor told me I had a gift for patience that he had rarely seen in someone my age. He meant it as a compliment. I took it as one. Before I was seconded to what we called the Baffin assessment, I had spent 4 years doing legitimate population studies on caribou herds in the Northwest Territories and 2 years monitoring polar bear denning behavior on the western shore of Hudson Bay. The caribou work had taken me across terrain that most Canadians would struggle to locate on a map. The Bathurst herd moving through the tundra between the tree line and the Arctic coast in patterns that had not changed in 10,000 years, or at least had not changed in the 60 years that systematic observation had been attempting to document them. I learned in those 4 years how to read a landscape that was not trying to communicate with you. The barren lands do not offer information easily. You earn what you learn there by being still and attentive and willing to be wrong in your first interpretation of what you are seeing. Those habits would matter considerably on Baffin Island, though I had no way of knowing that yet. The polar bear work on Hudson Bay was different in character from the caribou surveys, more sedentary, more technically demanding, more dependent on relationships with the Cree and Ojibwe communities along the coast who had been living alongside bear populations for generations and whose knowledge of the animals was more detailed than anything in the scientific literature. I was 28 years old when I started that posting, just married to a woman named Patricia who had grown up in Sudbury and who believed, when I took the position, that 2 years in the north would be an adventure. It was, but not the kind either of us had imagined. The isolation was real in a way that photographs did not capture, and that the recruiter had not thought to mention. The nearest city was Moosonee, which was itself not much of a city. The radio signal was unreliable. The mail came twice a week when the weather permitted. Patricia lasted 14 months before she drove south to her parents' place and mailed me a letter that was kind in its honesty and honest in its finality. I do not blame her. The life I had chosen was not a life that could be shared without wanting it as much as I did, and she had never wanted it quite that much. I was good at my work. I was thorough, I was patient, and I had a tolerance for the cold that my colleagues from southern Ontario did not share. Those three things are why Gordon Fawkes chose me. I should add a fourth quality that I did not recognize in myself at the time, but that Gordon apparently identified when he reviewed my personnel file before driving to Thunder Bay. I had never filed a formal complaint or grievance in 4 years of fieldwork, had never disputed an administrative decision from Ottawa, regardless of how badly that decision was suited to the realities on the ground, and had a record of completing assignments without asking for clarification I was not going to receive anyway. Gordon needed someone who could tolerate ambiguity at a professional level that most scientists are not trained to accept. He needed someone who would document what was in front of them and not require the institutional framework to tell them whether it was real. Gordon Fawkes was a deputy director in a division of the National Research Council of Canada that did not publish its activities. He was 53 years old in the spring of 1974 when he drove from Ottawa to Thunder Bay to meet me at a diner on the shore of Lake Superior, ordered black coffee, and told me that the federal government had a problem on Baffin Island that it needed a wildlife biologist to help document. He did not tell me everything that day. He told me enough. He said that Inuit hunters from the communities around Cumberland Sound and from Pond Inlet on the northern tip of the island had been reporting encounters with an unclassified animal for at least a decade, that the reports were internally consistent enough to warrant investigation, and that the investigation needed to be conducted quietly, because the alternative was a media situation that nobody in Ottawa wanted to manage. He said the reports described a large bipedal animal, and he paused after he said that, and he looked at me with an expression that wanted to see if a word had landed, and I said, "Are you talking about what I think you're talking about?" And he said yes. I said yes to Gordon Fawkes that afternoon in Thunder Bay, and I reported to Frobisher Bay on the southeastern tip of Baffin Island 11 days later with a bag full of cold weather gear, a set of scientific documentation forms that Gordon had designed himself, and a clearance level that I had never held before, and that I would not discuss with anyone for the next 17 years. Frobisher Bay was the administrative hub of what was then the Eastern Arctic, a community of roughly 2,000 people at the head of a deep fjord on the Meta Incognita Peninsula. The airport there was one of the few on the island capable of handling larger aircraft, a legacy of the American military presence during the Second World War and the Cold War. The Dew Line radar station north of town was still operational in those years, which meant there was a steady federal and military presence in the community, and a pair of wildlife biologists arriving with government identification and equipment raised no eyebrows whatsoever. That was, Gordon told me, deliberate.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, link's down below. And let's get you back to the video.
The other two men on the assessment team were already in Frobisher Bay when I arrived. The first was a man named Roy Cheswick, who was 41 at the time, a physical anthropologist from the University of Alberta who had spent years studying human skeletal remains from northern indigenous sites, and who had a working knowledge of Inuktitut that neither Gordon nor I possessed. Roy was short, bearded, quiet in that particular manner of men who spend a lot of time alone in archives, and he had a habit of listening to conversations as if he was cataloging them for later retrieval. The second was a younger man named Frank Vale, who was 28 and had come from a position with the Geological Survey of Canada, where he had spent 3 years doing field mapping across the eastern Arctic. Frank knew Baffin the way most people know their own neighborhoods. He knew the terrain, the weather patterns, the seasonal rhythms of the ice, and he knew people in every community on the island. He was the one who made things work on the ground. Gordon flew in from Ottawa for the first briefing, which took place in a rented space above a hardware supply store on the main road through Frobisher Bay. The room smelled of sawdust and motor oil from the store below, and the single window looked out over the fjord where the sea ice was pulling back in the early spring light. Gordon arrived with 2 cardboard boxes and a leather briefcase, and the slightly compressed manner of a man who has been carrying information he cannot discuss at a volume that would suit the occasion. He spread a series of topographic maps across a folding table, 1 to 50,000 scale, covering the entire island from Cape Dyer in the east to the Fox Basin in the west. They were marked in pencil with small circles and notations in a hand I did not recognize. He told us what the government actually knew at that point, which was less than I had hoped and more than I had expected. The Inuit reports had been accumulating since at least the early 1960s, passed along through DIAND field officers who had mostly filed them as folklore or misidentification and done nothing with them. This was not negligence on the officer's part, or not entirely. A field officer in the Eastern Arctic in the 1960s was managing housing programs, health referrals, trapline registrations, and 100 other administrative functions across communities separated by hundreds of kilometers of Arctic Ocean. A hunter's report of an unusual large animal was, in the context of everything else demanding attention, easy to log and move past. The pattern only became visible when someone in Ottawa thought to pull all those field reports and lay them side by side. That someone was a woman named Dr. Eleanor Marsh, a physical anthropologist at the National Museum of Natural Sciences, who had been given access to the DIAND files in the late 1960s as part of a broader review of indigenous land use documentation in the Eastern Arctic. Gordon mentioned her name once during that first briefing and did not mention it again, and I understood that she was either no longer involved or had been moved to a position in which her involvement was not to be discussed. I never found out which, but in 1971, a land use survey team working in the Inuit area on the Cumberland Peninsula had photographed a set of prints in snow-covered gravel beside the Weasel River that could not be attributed to any known Arctic species. The survey team had been mapping potential park boundaries in preparation for the establishment of what would eventually become Inuit National Park, designated in 1976. They were not looking for anything unusual. They were mapping drainage patterns in vegetation communities and documenting existing trails. The prints were found by accident in a sheltered section of the Weasel River Valley, where the gravel was fine enough to take a clear impression, and the survey team's lead, a geologist who had enough outdoor experience to know he was looking at something outside his reference frame, photographed everything he could before the light failed. He filed the photographs with his survey report under a catch-all category for unusual findings and did not expect anyone to do anything with them. The prints were sent to the National Museum of Natural Sciences in Ottawa, where a curator in the vertebrate zoology department who was not told their origin examined them and wrote in an internal memo that the proportions and dermal ridge characteristics were consistent with a large bipedal hominid and inconsistent with bear, which was the obvious first alternative. The memo noted the print length at 41 centimeters and the width at the metatarsal at 17 centimeters and estimated a body weight of between 400 and 600 pounds based on impression depth in the substrate. The curator did not offer a species attribution. He wrote, in the memo's closing line, that the prints were unlike anything in his reference collection and that he could not speak to their origin without additional context he did not have. That memo made its way to Gordon's division through channels I never fully understood, and the Baffin assessment began. Gordon was careful, at that first briefing, to describe the program's parameters in terms that gave each of us room to decide what we were committing to. He did not tell us what we would find. He told us what had been reported and what the limited physical evidence suggested and what the program was designed to do, which was document systematically. He said that scientific integrity required that we begin from a position of rigorous skepticism and follow the evidence wherever it led, and that if the evidence led nowhere, the program would be wound down and the files archived as inconclusive. He said this, I believe, because he understood that each of us had built careers on scientific credibility, and that asking us to abandon that standard, even implicitly, would cost him the program before it started. He was right to frame it that way. Roy, in particular, would not have agreed to the terms on any other basis. I want to stop here and address what anyone who knows the Arctic will immediately raise. Baffin Island is above the tree line, between the 63rd and 73rd parallels. Tundra, rock, glacial outwash, fjord walls, ice. No forests, no dense brush corridors, none of the habitat the Bigfoot research community associates with these animals. My first objection to Gordon was exactly that. He said the established understanding was built on what had been reported, and nobody had looked seriously at the Arctic because nobody had thought to look. He said the penny ice cap alone covered 23,000 square kilometers of the island's central highlands, with valleys and fjords radiating from it that no field survey team had ever systematically examined. An animal adapted to cold could survive there on sea mammals and fish from the fjords, and on the caribou herds crossing the island seasonally. The question was not whether it was possible. The question was what was actually there. I spent my first winter on Baffin Island understanding the place before I started looking for anything in it. This was Gordon's instruction, and it was correct. You cannot work in a landscape that you do not understand. And understanding Baffin Island's landscape was not something that happened in a single season or through a single approach. The island is enormous, roughly the size of Spain, and it contains within itself multiple distinct ecological zones that do not resemble each other. The coast of Cumberland Sound, where we were based out of Pagnatung, is fjord country. Deep water between walls of rock that can rise 700 meters straight from the waterline. The kind of terrain that makes a person feel very small in a way that is not unpleasant, but that is also never entirely comfortable. The interior is different, higher and more exposed, the penny ice cap sitting like a white continent at the center of the island and generating its own weather patterns, its own wind systems, its own relationship with temperature that does not follow the same schedule as the coasts around it. And the northern coast, which we would not reach until 1977, is different again. More open, less sheltered, exposed to the full force of the weather moving through Lancaster Sound and Eclipse Sound from the high Arctic. Frank Vail was essential to that process of understanding. He had been on the island long enough to know it the way field people know landscapes they have spent years in. Not through maps and descriptions, but through the accumulated experience of moving through it in all seasons and in all weather, getting things wrong, correcting the errors, and building a practical knowledge that no graduate program produced. He knew which valleys held wind and which shed it. He knew where the ice on the fjords was stable by February and where it remained unreliable because of the current patterns below. He knew the communities and the families and the complicated social geography of a place where the settlements were small enough that everyone's history was visible to everyone else. He introduced me to hunters from the Pagnatung community, a settlement of about 1,000 people at the head of a fjord on Cumberland Sound, and he helped me begin conversations through an Inuit interpreter named Thomas Akiarak, who had worked with DIAND field teams before and who understood that some conversations were not for general circulation. Thomas was in his late 40s at that time, a hunter and elder whose family had lived on the Sound for generations, whose grandfather had been born before the first permanent settlement was established in the area. He was a compact, deliberate man who moved through the landscape with a quality of attention that I came to recognize as the baseline competence of someone who had spent their life in conditions where inattention had consequences. He was funny in a dry, understated way that took me several months to fully calibrate to. He was also, once he had made a determination that you were worth talking to honestly, one of the most direct people I have worked with. He spoke about the encounters he had witnessed and heard described by others with a matter-of-factness that I found striking. He did not present them as supernatural experiences. He did not use the dramatic framing that the southern Bigfoot community applied to sightings. He described them the way he described seeing a polar bear or a narwhal, as encounters with a real animal that existed in the world and that his people had knowledge of. The first conversation I had with Thomas about this topic took place in the kitchen of his house in Pagnatung in November of 1974, over tea that he brewed in a pot that looked older than either of us. Frank was there, and Frank's Inuktitut was good enough to catch what the interpreter missed. Thomas had asked me what I actually wanted to know, cutting past the formal preamble that the DIN documentation process typically involved. And I told him the truth, which was that I wanted to understand what people in the community had encountered in the terrain around Cumberland Sound that could not be explained by any species in the standard Arctic wildlife reference. He looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone assessing whether the question deserves a real answer, and then he said that the question was a reasonable one, and that he had been wondering when someone from the government would ask it without already having decided what the answer was. Thomas used a term in Inuktitut that I spent considerable time trying to accurately understand. Frank helped me with this, and later Roy Cheswick refined the translation through his own conversations with elders in Pond Inlet and Clyde River. The word Thomas used was Tijaruk in its rough phonetic form, though I was told the spelling varied significantly across communities and that the word itself was applied to several different large beings in the oral tradition. What mattered to us was that the description associated with this particular term was consistent across communities separated by hundreds of kilometers of some of the most isolated terrain in the country, large, upright, covered in dark hair, capable of silence that seemed impossible for its size, associated with the seacoast and the mouths of rivers in spring and summer, and with rock formations and cave systems in the fiords during winter. Thomas said his father had seen one on 2 separate occasions near the head of Cumberland Sound in the 1940s. He said the encounters had not frightened his father because his father knew what it was and understood that it was not interested in people who were not threatening it. He said the old knowledge was that these beings were best left alone and that they had been on the island since before the Inuit arrived from the west. That last detail lodged itself in my mind and did not leave. Before the Inuit arrived. The Inuit reached the eastern Arctic from Alaska via the Thule culture expansion roughly 1,000 years ago. Whatever Thomas's people carried in their oral tradition about these beings predated that arrival in some form, which meant the knowledge was old in a way that I found difficult to frame in any scientific category I had been trained in. The first winter was documentation and relationship building. By spring of 1975, Roy had assembled a database of 63 separate accounts from across the island, from Clyde River on the northeastern coast to Iqaluit in the southeast to Pond Inlet at the northern tip. The accounts shared enough consistent detail that the hypothesis of mass misidentification became increasingly difficult to defend. The described animal was consistently bipedal. It was consistently large, with height estimates clustering between 7 and 9 feet based on how witnesses described its relationship to landscape features. It was consistently described as covered in dark hair, near black or very dark brown, which was notable because it was not the reddish-brown coloring common in mainland Bigfoot accounts, and Roy speculated that the darker pigmentation might represent an adaptive difference in a population that had been isolated in the Arctic for an extended period. Its tracks were found in snow, in Arctic mud during the brief summer, and in the silt deposits at the mouths of rivers where Arctic char ran in summer. Those fish-associated tracks would become some of our most significant physical evidence. The first time I saw evidence myself was in July of 1975. Frank and I had flown by charter floatplane to a lake system in the interior of the Cumberland Peninsula, an area of valleys and exposed rock ridges that sat between the Penny ice cap to the north and the Ayuyutuk fiords to the south. We were, on paper, conducting a survey of lake trout and Arctic char populations in the area, which was true in the sense that we were carrying the equipment and filling out the forms. But we were also looking at a report from a geological survey party the previous summer that had found unusual stone structures in one of the valleys near a lake they had designated only by grid reference in their field notes. The survey geologists had photographed the structures and noted them as unusual in a brief paragraph that they had apparently decided not to highlight in their main report, perhaps because they did not want to spend time explaining them. The structures were real. We found them on the second day of that trip, tucked into a rock-sheltered area where a creek drained into the lake from the north. The approach was along the east bank of the creek, following a narrow strip of gravel between the water and the base of a rock face that rose about 20 meters above us. The light was the flat, diffuse light of an overcast July day in the high Arctic, and the shadows were minimal, which meant the structures announced themselves not through contrast, but through pattern. The human eye is trained to recognize geometric organization in landscapes that do not organically produce it. And the moment I saw the first configuration through the binoculars, my visual processing registered deliberateness before my conscious mind had processed the details. They were not elaborate, but they were deliberate. 3 separate configurations of stones, the largest about 4 meters across, arranged in patterns that were not consistent with natural geological processes and not consistent with Inuit tent ring construction, which Roy had documented extensively in his earlier work and knew better than anyone on the team. Tent rings are circular, and the stones used are typically small and flat, chosen for their portability by people who move camps with the seasons and do not leave behind weight they will need to carry again. The construction Roy was looking at operated on a different logic entirely. These structures used stones that averaged 40 to 60 kilograms each, boulders that required significant force to move and position, placed in configurations that Roy, after examining them for several hours, while Frank and I documented the surrounding area, said he could not attribute to any human construction tradition he recognized from either indigenous or European contexts. The largest configuration was a rough arc, concave on the south side, with the open face oriented toward the lake's edge below. Roy measured the arc's radius at about 3 meters and estimated the total mass of stone involved at several tons. He could not determine the construction method without knowing the original positions of the boulders, but he said that the positioning of the largest stones, which were seated in depressions that appeared to have been excavated from the underlying gravel, suggested that the stones had been placed rather than rolled, meaning that whoever or whatever built the structure had lifted those boulders into position rather than levering them along the ground. Frank tried lifting the smallest stone in the arc. It did not move. One of the configurations, a smaller arrangement about 2 meters across, had a shallow depression at its center, roughly 1.5 meters deep, lined with compressed vegetation that had partially desiccated but still retained enough structure to identify. The vegetation was mostly Arctic willow and sedge grasses from the surrounding area, and it was layered in a way that suggested deliberate bedding rather than accidental accumulation. The willow had been folded and packed, not simply gathered and dropped. The sedge was arranged in overlapping layers, with the coarser material at the base and finer material at the surface. It was, as far as I could determine from the evidence in front of me, a bed, made for a specific body in a specific posture by something that understood the relationship between insulation and comfort at a level that implied regular use of sleeping surfaces constructed for the purpose. Roy pressed his hands into the bedding material and then looked at me and said that something large had lain in that depression within the last few weeks. He estimated this from the compression patterns in the vegetation and from the fact that the willow stems at the center of the depression had not yet begun to rehydrate from the recent moisture, which he said would have happened within a month in the brief Arctic summer. Whatever had used this bed had been here in late June or early July. We were standing there in mid-July. The margin was weeks, not seasons. We found the prints the following morning, in the silt at the creek mouth where it entered the lake. The creek ran clear and cold from the snowfields above, and the silt it deposited at the lake edge was fine and receptive. There were 7 clear impressions in a line running from the water's edge up the bank toward the stone structures. Each print was roughly 43 centimeters in length and 18 centimeters across the ball of the foot, with 5 toe impressions that were distinctly wider and more spread than a human foot. The depth of the impressions suggested significant body weight, and the stride length between prints was about 160 centimeters, or just over 5 feet. I photographed every print from multiple angles, made plaster casts of the 4 clearest ones, and took measurements that I recorded in the documentation forms Gordon had given us. Roy examined the dermal ridges under a field magnifier and confirmed that what he was seeing was consistent with the physical characteristics of the prints from the Weasel River photographs from 1971. The same animal, or an animal of the same type, had been at this lake. I want to be precise about how I felt. I had been a working biologist for 6 years before that morning, trained to separate what evidence showed from what I wanted it to show. Standing at the edge of that lake with plaster setting in the prints and the wind off the ice cap at about 12 degrees, I did not feel awe or terror. I felt a hypothesis becoming substantially more probable, and underneath that a quieter recognition that the world I had understood before coming to Baffin Island was smaller than the world I was now standing in. The specific quality of that recognition is worth trying to describe accurately, because I think it is different from the popular account of what it would feel like to encounter evidence of this kind. Popular accounts tend toward the dramatic. Discovery narratives are structured around revelation, around the moment when the curtain is pulled back and the hidden truth becomes suddenly and completely visible. That is not what standing beside those prints felt like. It felt more like the slow adjustment of a calibration that had been slightly off for a long time, and that was now moving incrementally toward a setting that matched the actual signal. I had grown up in a world that told me these beings did not exist. The scientific establishment said so. The federal agencies whose work I had spent my career inside said so, or at least declined to say otherwise. The cultural assumption embedded in every piece of media I had consumed since childhood said so. That assumption does not dissolve in a single morning beside a lake in the high Arctic, regardless of what the plaster is setting around. What dissolves is the certainty, the absolute quality that the assumption carried. What replaces it is not belief exactly, but the willingness to hold the question open in a way that was not possible before, because the evidence now demands it. Frank was quieter than usual that afternoon. He had the same training I did, the same instinct to be conservative about interpretation, and he was applying it carefully to what we had found. But at one point, while we were cataloging the fish bone samples near the stone structures, he stopped working and looked up the valley toward the ridge above us and said, without preamble, that he had been on this island for 4 years and had never felt watched before today. I asked him what he meant. He said he was not sure. He said it was nothing specific, no sound or movement or smell, just a quality in the atmosphere above the valley that had not been there when we arrived that morning. I said nothing. I had felt the same thing since about mid-morning. We did not discuss it further that day. We finished our documentation, made camp, cooked our meal, and went about the business of the field in the way that scientists do when the evidence is telling them something they are not yet ready to say out loud. We spent 3 more days at that lake. We found additional stone structures further up the valley, older ones based on lichen growth that Frank estimated between 40 and 80 years, placing use of the site back to at least the 1930s. Fish bones lay near several structures, Arctic char, clean and disarticulated, with cut marks Roy said were inconsistent with bear predation patterns, more precise, more intentional. He held one up and said that in an archaeological context, he would attribute the mark to a stone tool. Gordon Fawkes flew from Ottawa to Frobisher Bay the following month to review what we had collected, and I watched him look at the photographs and the plaster casts and the fishbone analysis notes for a long time without speaking. Gordon was not a man who showed his reactions easily. He had spent his career in federal service in divisions where the first professional skill you developed was the ability to receive information of any kind without visibly reacting to it. But he looked at those plaster casts for a long time, and when he looked up, he said he was authorizing an expansion of the assessment and an extension of the funding. He said he needed us to understand that what we documented was going to remain inside the program and was not going to be published, presented at conferences, or discussed with colleagues outside the 3 of us and himself. He said the government's position was that a formal acknowledgement of what these reports described would create a legal and jurisdictional situation in the Northwest Territories that nobody in Ottawa was prepared to manage, and that the responsible course was to continue documenting quietly and thoroughly, and to deliver findings through channels that would be reviewed by people above his level. He said this without apparent discomfort, which told me he had already worked through his own version of the ethical questions I was only beginning to develop. I will not pretend I did not struggle with what Gordon said. My training was built on the foundation that findings are meant to be shared. Agreeing to document something of this significance and lock it inside a classified program was not a neutral act. Roy argued with Gordon that afternoon, quietly but with a directness I respected, about the scientific responsibility they were accepting. Gordon said Roy was right in principle, and that the choice was between that principle and the alternative, which was the program being shut down, the findings archived beyond any of their access, and whatever was on Baffin Island continuing without any documentation at all. Roy was quiet for a moment, and then he said he understood. By the summer of 1976, the Baffin assessment had expanded in two directions. Gordon had arranged for us to have access to a small field station on the shore of Pangnertung Fjord, a collection of 4 prefabricated structures that had been established by a federally funded environmental monitoring program, and that we shared with a rotating crew of 2 technicians who believed they were assisting with a caribou impact study. They were, in a limited sense. We genuinely collected caribou data. But the caribou work was the cover, and the real work was being done in the fiords and the interior valleys during the periods when the technicians were focused on their own tasks. The second expansion was the addition of Thomas Archaeological to our informal team. Thomas was not a government employee, and his involvement was never documented anywhere. He was paid in cash, which Gordon arranged through a discretionary account that I never asked too many questions about. Thomas's value was not just as an interpreter. He was an exceptional tracker who had spent his entire adult life reading this landscape, and he had knowledge of specific locations across the island where encounters had been reported repeatedly over generations. He called these places by Inuktitut names, and he knew their locations from oral tradition that stretched back through his grandfather's stories and beyond. When we visited those locations, we found them consistently associated with the kind of evidence we had been collecting. Stone structures, fish remains, prints. Thomas would examine a site and give us information about when the sign was recent and when it was old, and his assessments were always consistent with what our own analysis produced. He did not find this surprising. He had grown up understanding that these beings existed, and the thing that surprised him was that we were surprised. Thomas told me during the summer of 1976 that his grandmother had described these beings as old, in a specific way. Not old as a person is old, or as a species is considered old. Old in the sense that the Inuit term for them in the oldest oral tradition was not a word for an animal or a person, but something closer to what the landscape itself was. She told him they did not have a homeland somewhere else. The rock and the ice and the fjords, the long dark winters and the brief violent summers, this was where they came from and where they would remain regardless of what arrived after them. I am aware that translating oral tradition, at a remove of 50 years through an interpreter, is imprecise, but what Thomas communicated sat with me not because it was mystical, but because it had a specific biological resonance. If a population of large hominids had been on the eastern Arctic islands for tens of thousands of years, long enough to be embedded in the oral tradition of people who had themselves only been there for 1,000, then what we were looking at was not a population that had wandered north from the boreal forests. It was a population that had adapted to the Arctic over a period that would have required significant physiological changes. Changes that would explain both the unusual coloring and the behavioral characteristics that distinguish the Baffin accounts from the mainland reports. The first direct sighting I am going to tell you about happened in September of 1976, and it happened to Frank Vale, and it was not something I witnessed myself, which I want to be clear about before I describe it. Frank was conducting a solo survey of the coastline south of Pangnertung by inflatable Zodiac, documenting ringed seal haul-out sites for the cover study. He had anchored the boat in a small cove and was sitting on a rock above the waterline writing up his notes when he became aware of a smell. He described it to me that evening as a combination of things he had no direct analogy for. Animal, yes. Dense, yes, but not rank as large carnivores tend to be. Warmer, more complex. He said later that the closest approximation he could find was the smell of a large mammal in a confined space, multiplied, concentrated. He looked up from his notes. On the far side of the cove, perhaps 80 meters away, a figure was standing at the water's edge. Frank had been in the Arctic for 5 years, and he was not a person prone to imaginative interpretations of landscape features. He had a geologist's eye for what belongs in a landscape and what does not. An eye trained on thousands of hours of field work reading rock formations and terrain features for information. And the figure he was looking at did not belong in the landscape the way an expected element belongs. He told me that the first thing his brain presented was a person in a dark coat, because the upright posture and the proportions of the figure were clearly bipedal. A person is what you default to when you see a large biped on a shoreline. But the proportions were wrong for a person, and the wrongness registered within the first few seconds. The figure was too tall even at that distance. Frank had been to the rock face on the far side of that cove before, during an earlier coastal survey, and he knew its dimensions. He used a ledge on the face, about 2 meters from the base, as a reference point to estimate the figure's height. It was taller than the ledge by what he estimated at a significant margin, which put its height at somewhere between 7 and 8 feet. The shoulders were too wide for any human he could reasonably imagine. The limbs were too long relative to the torso, the arms in particular hanging with an extension that suggested a reach far beyond human proportion. The hands, when the arms were at rest, falling to a level well below the hip. And it was standing with a stillness that no person stands with outdoors in a September wind off the fjord. People shift their weight. People adjust their footing. People turn their head and look at things in their peripheral field. The figure did none of these things. It stood the way a rock formation stands, as if stillness was its default state, and any movement would require a conscious decision to override it. Frank said he sat without moving for what he estimated was 4 minutes, and the figure stood without moving for the same duration. He told me later that during those 4 minutes he ran through every alternative explanation he could construct for what he was seeing and dismissed each one as he constructed it. A person of unusual height in dark outdoor gear. Dismissed because of the limb proportions which no clothing could account for. A polar bear on its hind legs. Dismissed because polar bears do not maintain full vertical posture for 4 minutes, and because the figure's silhouette was clearly not a bear's. A dark rock formation he had not registered on his earlier visit. Dismissed because the formation was standing at the water's edge where he had anchored his Zodiac, and he would have been within 20 meters of it at that point. He ran through the list and found nothing that held. And by the time the figure moved, he had stopped trying to find an explanation and was simply looking. Then it turned and walked along the waterline, away from him, into a crack in the fjord wall that he had not noticed from the water, and that he subsequently determined, when he returned the following day with Frank's inflatable and a flashlight, was an overhanging rock shelter deep enough to be invisible from any angle except the specific position on the rock where he had been sitting when he looked up from his notes. The shelter extended perhaps 4 meters into the face of the fjord wall, with a ceiling that cleared the entrance height by perhaps half a meter more than the figure's estimated stature, meaning the figure would have had to duck slightly to enter. Frank found the entrance marked by a single clear footprint in the wet gravel at the threshold. He photographed it and left it undisturbed, and came back to Pangnirtung and sat down at the table where I was working and told me what he had seen. He watched it walk perhaps 30 meters before it disappeared into the rock. He said the gait was fluid and unhurried and covered ground at a pace that was faster than it appeared. He sat on the rock for another 20 minutes before he moved. He motored back to Pangnirtung, came to the field station, sat down at the table where I was working, and told me exactly what he had seen. He told it once, start to finish, without embellishment or qualification, in the flat, descriptive tone he used to record field observations. Then he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "It was not afraid of me." That last detail was the one I kept returning to in the weeks that followed. Not afraid. Thomas had said something similar when he described his father's encounters, that these beings had no fear response to humans that his father had recognized. Not the aggressive alarm of a bear that has been surprised, not the flight response of caribou. More like assessment, a decision to observe and then to leave, executed without urgency. I had been expecting fear. Not from us toward it, though that would have been understandable given what Frank described. I had been expecting some version of the response that large wild animals typically show toward humans in the modern world. The response of a species that has learned through accumulated experience that humans represent danger. That learning is visible in the behavior of every large mammal that has had significant contact with human hunters over a long period. Bears in hunted areas behave differently from bears in protected areas. Wolves in regions of active conflict with ranching communities carry a wariness in their encounter behavior that wolves in low-pressure environments do not show. The baseline behavioral signature of a species that has been threatened is a specific and recognizable thing in field observation, and Frank's description of the figure on the far shore of the cove did not match it. What Frank described was something closer to what you see in very large predators that have no natural enemies in their own landscape. The quality of attention without alarm. The decision to remain and observe rather than to withdraw or to challenge. The patience. That combination of characteristics in a very large, clearly intelligent animal implied a population that had not been hunted, had not been pushed from its territory, had not developed the particular behavioral adaptations that come from sustained conflict with a competing presence. It implied a population that had been left alone for long enough that human beings did not register in its threat matrix as anything requiring a defensive response. Thomas, when I described this reasoning to him that winter, said that his grandfather had expressed it differently. He said his grandfather had always described these beings as the ones who were already here, meaning not just that they predated the Inuit presence on the island, but that they predated the concept of any other presence. They were not responding to humans because humans were not yet old enough in their landscape to be fully legible to them. We were, in his grandfather's framing, relatively recent arrivals who had not yet earned enough history in that place to be treated as anything more than occasional, mildly interesting features of the terrain. Roy pushed Frank for every detail he could produce over the following days: height relative to the fjord wall rock faces, which we could measure, stride length estimated against known distances at the cove. Hair color, which Frank described as near black with a slight brownish tinge in the low September sun, darker at the shoulders and back, slightly lighter on the upper arms. The face, which Frank had seen for only a moment when the figure turned before entering the rock shelter, looking directly at him across the cove. Roy asked about the face in particular, with the careful precision of a physical anthropologist. Frank said the brow was very pronounced, heavy over the eyes in a way that produced deep shadow. The nose was broad, the jaw was wide and set forward. He said it looked like nothing he could directly reference, but that the closest thing he could identify in his own mental inventory was a human face that had been reshaped by a different set of evolutionary priorities. He used that phrase, a different set of evolutionary priorities. Roy wrote it down verbatim and underlined it. The 1977 season brought us to the northern end of the island for the first time. Thomas had told us about reports from the Pond Inlet community, which sits on the north coast of Baffin overlooking Eclipse Sound and the mountains of Bylot Island across the water. The terrain around Pond Inlet is more dramatic than the southern part of the island, with steep ridges rising directly from the coast and a network of narrow valleys running inland toward the mountains. The community itself was small, around 400 people in those years, predominantly Inuit, and the hunters there had a specific tradition of accounts involving the interior valleys above the settlement. We flew in on a twin otter in late June, as the sea ice was beginning to break up in the Sound. Pond Inlet in late June is one of the more striking places I have seen, and I have spent my career in landscapes that most people consider extreme. The community sits at the narrow opening of Eclipse Sound, with the peaks of Bylot Island directly across the water, their glaciers reflecting light off the water in a way that makes the air itself seem luminous. The sea ice in late June is fractured and shifting, great gray-white plates moving on the current, and the light is continuous, 24 hours of it, cycling through amber and gold and a particular blue that exists only in the Arctic at that latitude, at that time of year. The birds are everywhere in June. Thick-billed murres and black guillemots and northern fulmars working the leads in the ice, and the hunters are out on the remaining ice and in boats along the open lanes because June is when the narwhal move through Eclipse Sound on their migration east, and narwhal are important enough to the community that everything else pauses for the hunt. Gordon had arranged accommodation through the local DIA&D office, and Thomas came north with us to help establish contact with the Pond Inlet elders. The community in 1977 was smaller than Pangnirtung, roughly 400 people, and the social geography was tight in the way of any community where everyone has known everyone for generations. Thomas had connections here through family and through the network of hunters that linked communities across the island in ways that did not require roads or scheduled transportation. He knew who to talk to, and more importantly, he knew how to present us in a way that did not make us seem like another version of the federal officials who had been arriving in these communities for decades to count things, measure things, and leave again without giving anything useful in return. The elder he brought us to was a man named Inuit, whose age Thomas estimated at somewhere past 70, though his face was the kind that becomes difficult to date after a certain point, weathered to a flatness and a stillness that is not age exactly, but the accumulation of a specific kind of outdoor life sustained over many decades. He received us in his house on a gray afternoon while the fog sat low on the sound, and he served tea and looked at us with the particular assessment that men who have spent their lives reading conditions and making decisions based on those readings apply to everything they encounter. After perhaps 20 minutes of conversation about other things, weather, the narwhal migration, a piece of DIN business that Thomas deflected with a brevity that I admired, Inuit said he understood what we were actually there for, and he would tell us what he knew. He had seen what he described twice in the valley systems above the town. The first time had been in summer, 35 years earlier, when he was a young man checking traps in a valley about 5 kilometers from the settlement. He had seen it crossing a patch of open ground above the creek, and the distance had been enough that he could report the size and the upright posture and the near black hair and the movement pattern, but not the details of the face or the hands. He said it had not acknowledged him, had continued across the open ground and into a rock gully on the far side without altering its pace or direction. He had watched it go and then finished checking his traps and come home and told his father, who had said simply that he was not the first and would not be the last and should not make more of it than it was. He told us, through Thomas, that the second time, 30 years earlier, had been in late winter, a period when the Arctic is in near total darkness, and the cold on the northern coast of Baffin can reach -40 with wind chill. He had been checking a trap line in a narrow valley about 8 kilometers from the settlement, alone, in the dark, in conditions that demanded complete attention to navigation and to the state of the ice on the frozen creek he was following. He said he had not seen the being clearly but had heard it, and the hearing had been enough. A series of deep, low calls that moved through the valley in a pattern suggesting more than one source, at least 2, possibly 3, he thought, calling back and forth in a sequence that had a structure he described as deliberate. Not random, not territorial, something closer to conversation. Inuit said he had not run. He had stood still and listened until the calls stopped, and then he had completed his trap check and walked home in the dark. When Thomas asked him why he had not run, he looked at us as if the question was slightly beside the point, and said that running from something you do not understand is not always the wise choice. He said his grandfather had taught him that these beings had their own business and that a person who did not interfere with that business was generally left alone. He said he had interfered with nothing that night. He had simply been present, and they had been present, and then they had left, and he had continued with what he was doing. The valley above Pond Inlet gave us our best physical evidence to that point. We spent 2 weeks in the interior above the community in July of 1977, and on the 5th day, Frank found a site that would become the most significant location in our 17 years of work. It was tucked into a rock overhang in the south face of a ridge, sheltered from the prevailing north winds and oriented to catch what sun reached those latitudes in the brief warm months. The overhang created a natural cavity perhaps 6 meters deep and 4 meters high at the opening, tapering toward the back. The floor was packed earth mixed with fine gravel, and it had been used repeatedly, over what the evidence suggested was a significant period of time. Roy spent 3 days at that site, systematic in the way of someone trained to let evidence speak for itself. He documented layers of occupation material going down to about 40 centimeters before hitting bedrock. Each layer contained organic material, primarily fish bones and the remains of ringed seal and beluga whale. Each layer also contained tool marks on bone fragments. Stone-worked edges, consistent with intentional modification but unlike any tool tradition Roy had documented in his Arctic archaeological work. Not Dorset, not Thule, nothing from any tradition he recognized. He took samples from several layers, enough for radiocarbon dating, which we processed through a university laboratory in Ontario several months later, using a cover story about Ice Age faunal remains. The results came back across a range. The deepest material we sampled dated to about 800 years old, plus or minus a margin of a few decades. The upper layers were much more recent, some within the last 20 or 30 years. The site had been in continuous or periodic use for at least 8 centuries. I remember sitting with Roy outside the overhang on the last day of our work there, with the sun low over Baffin Island across the sound and the air cold enough that we could see our breath even in July. The light at that latitude at that hour was the long, raking, amber light that comes when the sun barely dips below the ridgeline before rising again. The kind of light that makes landscape features look older than they are, because the shadows it produces are horizontal rather than vertical, and give every rock face a quality of deep time that the same face at noon does not have. Roy had his field notebook open on his knee and was writing something, and he stopped writing and looked out at the sound for a while, and then he said, very quietly, that if the same type of site existed on the mainland and contained evidence of 800 years of continuous occupation, it would be considered one of the most significant archaeological finds in the country's history, and teams from every major university in Canada would be competing for the excavation rights. He was right, and we both knew it. The radiocarbon results from the Ontario laboratory had come back in stages over the winter, and the picture they assembled was more coherent than any of us had expected. The deepest stratum of occupation material we had sampled dated to about 800 years old, which placed the first confirmed use of the site in the late 12th or early 13th century. That was before the Thule culture expansion reached the eastern Arctic. It was before the Norse made sustained contact with the Dorset people on Baffin shores. It was, in other words, during a period when the only beings using this island were the Dorset people and whoever or whatever else had been there before them. The intermediate layers showed continued periodic use across several centuries, with gaps that might represent seasonal movement rather than abandonment. The upper layers, dated to within the previous 50 years, showed use continuing into the lifetimes of people we had spoken to in Pond Inlet. The site had not been abandoned, it was active. Roy explained to me, during one of those long evenings at the Pangnertung station, when the sun refused to set and the three of us found ourselves talking through things that the workday had not resolved, what the radiocarbon evidence meant in evolutionary terms if taken at face value. He said that a population maintaining continuous or near continuous use of specific sites for 8 centuries was not a population in decline or in retreat. It was a population with functional territorial memory across multiple generations, with the kind of site fidelity that indicated not desperation but stability. He said that in primate behavioral ecology, site fidelity of that duration was associated with social complexity, with the transmission of learned knowledge across generations, with what behavioral biologists in other contexts would call culture. He said this carefully, with the hedges that a physical anthropologist applies when moving from evidence to interpretation. But he said it. Instead of publishing any of this, we were the only ones who knew the site was there, and when we left the following morning we would not be publishing anything, and the site would continue to exist in exactly the state it had been in before we arrived. Roy said this without bitterness. He said it in the way that scientists sometimes describe the gap between what is and what should be, as a factual statement about the conditions under which they are working. Then he closed his notebook and picked up his coffee mug, which had gone cold, and drank it anyway. And we sat there in the amber light watching the ice on Eclipse Sound shift and groan as the tide moved under it, and neither of us said anything else for a long time. 1978 brought a development none of us had anticipated. In early August, one of the DI and field technicians at the Pangnirtung station, a young man named Philip Doss from Winnipeg, who had been with us for one season, reported to the station supervisor that he had seen an extremely large animal near the shore of the fjord, about 3 kilometers north of the settlement. He described it as bipedal and estimated it at over 7 feet in height. He had seen it from a helicopter, from an altitude of about 200 meters, and it had been visible for less than 30 seconds before the helicopter moved out of line of sight. Philip filed his report with the supervisor, who filed it with the regional DIAND office in Frobisher Bay, where it should have been routine wildlife incident documentation. Instead, it reached Gordon Fawkes in Ottawa within 48 hours, and Gordon reached me by radio the following morning. His message was brief and controlled. He said that the assessment team should be aware of a wildlife incident report from the Pangnirtung area, that the situation was being managed, and that we should continue normal operations. I knew what the situation is being managed meant in Gordon's language. Someone would speak to Philip Doss, and Philip Doss would be persuaded that what he had seen from a moving helicopter at 200 meters altitude in imperfect light was most likely a polar bear standing on its hind legs, which they do occasionally. Philip was a careful young man and a good observer, and I did not think he would be easily persuaded, but I also did not know him well enough to predict his response to a conversation with a deputy director from Ottawa. Philip was transferred to a different posting within 2 weeks, and his incident report was reclassified. Gordon told me this himself. Philip had been treated fairly. The alternative was a situation no one in the program was prepared to manage. I accepted this, and I still find that acceptance uncomfortable when I examine it, which I think is the minimum intellectual honesty a person owes themselves after participating in what we were participating in. By 1978, the assessment had settled into a rhythm that I would carry for the next 13 years, a way of working that organized itself around the Arctic calendar with the same inevitability as everything else on the island. The spring season ran from late March through early May, when the snowpack was consolidated enough to hold clear tracks, but the light had returned sufficiently to work long days, and when the beings we were documenting sometimes ranged farther from their winter shelter sites in patterns that left impressions across open terrain that we could cover by snowmobile. The summer season ran from late June through early September, when the interior valleys were accessible on foot or by float plane, when the fjord mouth sites were active with fish processing, and when the Arctic summer produced its particular quality of continuous light that made 16-hour field days not only possible, but after a while, normal. The Pangnirtung field station became the center of my life in a way that I had not anticipated when I arrived on the island. A collection of 4 prefabricated structures on the shore of the fjord, Barely adequate by any standard of comfort, but adequately windproof and consistently heated, it was the place I ate and slept and wrote and argued and occasionally felt the particular loneliness that comes from working on something that cannot be discussed with anyone outside a very small circle. Roy and Frank rotated through on different schedules, and there were periods during the spring seasons when I was alone at the station for 2 and 3 weeks at a time, going out in the mornings to check sites and returning in the evenings to write field notes that would be read by Gordon and the Ottawa analysts and no one else. Those periods of solitude were not unpleasant, but they had a quality of weight to them that accumulated over the years. The work demanded so much of my attention that there was not much left over for the question of what the work was doing to me. And I am not sure I would have answered that question honestly even if I had put it to myself directly. The pattern of 2 field seasons per year extended through the late 1970s and across the full sweep of the 1980s. We covered ground from Pond Inlet in the north to the Fox Peninsula in the south, about 1,000 kilometers of the island's most varied and isolated terrain, and identified 16 sites that we considered either confirmed or probable occupation locations. Gordon brought in 2 additional analysts in Ottawa to process our documentation, people I never met who worked from photographs and reports and plaster casts in a government building, and whose names I was never given. I thought about those 2 people occasionally, going through our documentation in a government office in Ottawa while we collected it in valleys and on fjord shores that they would never see. I wondered what they made of it without the landscape as context, whether the evidence was legible without the sound and the cold and the smell that accompanied its collection, whether a plaster cast of a 43-centimeter print in a government building conveyed anything close to what it conveyed when you were kneeling beside the original in Arctic mud with the wind off the ice cap at your back. What the documentation showed was a small, dispersed population ranging across the eastern Arctic with a pattern tied to food availability. Summer evidence clustered at fjord mouths and river systems where char ran, particularly at the mouths of rivers in early July, when the first runs pushed inland and the fishing was concentrated in the shallow gravel beds where the deepest channels crossed. The beans we were documenting appeared to be selective in where they fished, favoring the same specific river sections season after season in a pattern that suggested either cultural transmission of knowledge about productive locations or a learned individual memory that persisted across decades of use. Some of the summer sites showed evidence of visit patterns that were annual at the same location across our entire documentation period. 17 years of evidence pointing to the same stretch of gravel on the same river used in the same July window year after year. Winter evidence appeared at rock shelter sites in protected valleys, with food caches stored in adjacent crevices with enough deliberation to suggest planning across seasons. The caching behavior was the single most behaviorally complex pattern we documented, because it required not just the storage of food, but the selection of appropriate storage sites, the preservation of food in conditions where long-term storage, without contamination, required an understanding of the relationship between temperature, moisture, and biological decay that went beyond instinct and into something closer to applied knowledge. The cache material was always fish or marine mammal, dried and in some cases partially fermented in ways that Roy said were consistent with cold climate preservation methods used by northern indigenous peoples, though the specific techniques differed from anything in his archaeological reference material. Not once in 16 years did we find caribou remains at a confirmed occupation site. The diet was almost entirely aquatic, which Roy said had implications for the morphology we might expect to see in a population that had maintained this dietary pattern across centuries, implications around jaw structure and gut physiology and metabolic adaptation that he was not in a position to verify, but that fit coherently with the other adaptive characteristics we had documented. Roy spent much of the early 1980s building a morphological profile from the track evidence, Frank's visual account, and hominid anatomy literature. He worked on this during the winter periods when field access was limited and when he was at his office in Edmonton, going through comparative anatomy references and the growing literature on primate biomechanics with the same patience he applied to archaeological site work. He told me once that the discipline required was unusual even for someone trained in physical anthropology, because every established framework he could use as a reference point was built on the study of living or extinct species with confirmed status in the taxonomic record, and what he was building a profile of had neither. He was constructing a morphological picture from negative space, from what the evidence showed and from what it deviated from, rather than from any positive classification. He was careful not to overreach the data, which was both good science and, I think, good self-protection. A physical anthropologist at a respected Canadian university who went on record with conclusions that exceeded the evidence he could demonstrate would find those conclusions followed him in ways he could not control. Roy knew this, and he built his internal report with the same structural conservatism he would have applied to a peer-reviewed paper, even though this particular paper would never be peer-reviewed by anyone outside our small group. His internal report, circulated only to Gordon and Frank and me, concluded that the documented characteristics were most consistent with a large bipedal hominid, not a member of Homo sapiens, but something distinct from anything in the taxonomic record, with physical adaptations suggesting a lineage that had developed in cold northern environments over a very long period. He devoted a section of the report to each adaptive characteristic in turn, building the case methodically from the evidence and resisting the temptation to speculate beyond what the documentation supported. He noted the near black hair as a possible cold weather adaptation. Darker pigmentation absorbs more solar radiation, which in the Arctic, where summer sun is available at low angles for extended hours, but at significantly reduced intensity compared to lower latitudes, would provide a meaningful thermoregulatory advantage. He compared this to the pigmentation patterns seen in some cold climate mammal populations, where selective pressure toward darker coloration in high-latitude subpopulations has been documented. And he noted that a population long isolated in the Arctic might be expected to show this characteristic in the absence of any competing selective pressure toward lighter pigmentation. He noted the track's characteristic flat, wide foot structure as potentially consistent with walking on ice and packed snow, where a wider base of support would be advantageous, and where the snowshoe principle, distributing weight across a broader contact area, would reduce the energy cost of travel across consolidated surfaces. He compared the foot proportions, scaled from the track evidence, to the foot proportions of human populations from high-latitude environments versus lower-latitude populations, and found that the pattern of wider, flatter feet in cold climate populations extended but did not fully explain what the track showed. The deviation from human proportion was too large to be accounted for by climate-adaptive variation within the human range. He noted the absence of any evidence of tool material other than stone and bone, with no indication of metal use or fiber working across any of the 16 sites, and he said this suggested either a population that had remained by choice separate from trade networks, or a population so isolated that contact with metal-using cultures had not occurred in any sustained way. He said he could not determine which, but that either explanation had significant implications for how the population related to the rest of the world, and how the rest of the world had, or had not, encountered it over the centuries of Arctic contact. The closest thing to a direct encounter that I personally experienced came in August of 1982 in a valley system on the Cumberland Peninsula, about 30 kilometers northeast of Pengnirtung. I was alone, which was unusual. Frank and Thomas were doing coastal work by boat and Roy was in Pengnirtung working through documentation. I had hiked up the valley to check a set of monitoring stakes we had placed at a site the previous season to see if there had been activity during the winter. The valley was about a kilometer wide, flanked by rock ridges, with a shallow river running through it from the snowfields above. The weather was the particular kind of overcast that turns everything the same flat gray. No shadows, no depth. The kind of light that makes distances difficult to judge. I was at the monitoring stakes, making notes, when I became aware of the smell. It arrived without wind to carry it, which was disorienting, as if it had simply appeared in the air around me. Dense and warm and organic, the same description Frank had given me and that I had read in every account Thomas had translated for us, but encountering it directly was different from reading about it. It was not unpleasant. That surprised me. I had assumed from the descriptions that it would be the musk of a large predator, the kind that triggered the avoidance response that prey animals carry. It was not that. It was more like stepping into a space that something very large and very warm had been occupying for a long time. I did not move. I stayed at the monitoring stakes and continued writing in my field notebook. And I was aware that this was partly a practical decision and partly something less rational, a conviction that staying still and continuing with what I was doing was the correct response. The smell intensified over the next 2 or 3 minutes, which meant something was moving closer, without any sound that I could detect over the river noise. Then, from my peripheral vision to the left, I became aware of movement on the ridge above the valley floor. A shape, large, moving along the ridgeline at a distance I estimated at 200 to 250 meters. It was above me, and the flat light made the details difficult, but the upright posture was clear. It was moving at a pace that covered the ridge without apparent effort, not hurrying, not stopping. It stopped. Directly above my position on the ridge, it stopped, and it was standing there looking down into the valley. I did not look up directly. I stayed at my stakes and I wrote in my notebook, and I was aware, with a certainty that had no rational foundation, that I was being examined, assessed. Whatever calculation that assessment involved was being made from 200 meters of elevation above me, while I stood at my monitoring stakes on a flat gray August day and wrote the same sentence 3 times because my attention was not entirely on my notebook. It stood there for what I later estimated at 6 to 8 minutes. Then it moved on along the ridge, continuing in the direction it had been traveling before it stopped. And within another minute the shape was gone and the smell began to dissipate. And I stood at my monitoring stakes and looked at what I had written in my notebook, which was mostly illegible because my handwriting deteriorates significantly when I am concentrating on something other than the page. That evening I described what I had experienced to Frank and Roy, and the 3 of us sat in the field station for a long time afterward in a conversation that touched on things that field reports do not normally address. This was unusual. We had spent years together in close quarters in remote places, and we had developed the particular communication economy that people develop when they work in isolation, a shorthand in which most things are implied rather than stated, and in which the unnecessary does not get said. But that evening was different. The experience in the valley had opened something in me that I did not have a scientific vocabulary for, and I needed to put it in front of the 2 people in the world most qualified to help me evaluate it, even if that evaluation was going to be inconclusive. I described the smell first, because the smell had been the earliest signal, and because it was the most concrete element, the one most amenable to objective description. Dense, warm, organic, arriving without a detectable wind vector which I had checked instinctively at the moment of first awareness by moistening a finger and holding it up. The air had been essentially still in the valley at that hour, the morning wind off the ice cap having not yet developed. Whatever produced the smell was close enough that diffusion rather than convection was carrying it to me. Roy noted this in his own notebook without comment. I described the shape on the ridge, the distance I estimated, the duration I estimated for its presence above my position, the quality of its movement, which had seemed deliberate in the specific sense that each step appeared considered rather than habitual. I described the stop, the way it stopped directly above me and did not move for the period I estimated at 6 to 8 minutes. I described writing the same sentence 3 times in my notebook. I described the dissipation of the smell after the shape moved on. I described all of this in the flat, sequential register of a field observation report, and when I finished, there was quiet for a while. Roy said that in all the archaeological work he had done, he had never sat in an excavation and felt the presence of what he was studying, and that what I was describing was categorically different from any scientific experience he had reference for, because the subject was not in the past, it was present. It was making decisions about us even as we were making decisions about it. He said this distinction mattered to him in ways he was still working out, because the entire discipline of archaeology is premised on the study of something that is not there anymore, and this was not that. Whatever we were documenting was there, it was operational. It had a behavioral repertoire that included observation and assessment of other beings in its landscape, which meant it had a relationship with the world that was continuous and adaptive rather than fixed and recordable only in the artifacts it left behind. Frank said, very quietly, that he had felt the same thing on the day in the cove. That whatever the being was doing when it looked across at him from the far shore, it was not doing what an animal without self-awareness does. Animals without self-awareness do not hold still and look at something for 4 minutes. They assess threat and either withdraw or hold position based on that assessment. But the quality of the attention is different. Frank had spent years in the field watching large mammals, polar bears specifically, and he said that a bear's attention, when it is looking at you, has a quality of threat calibration that you feel in a specific physical way, a heightening of your own alert systems that is essentially involuntary. What he had felt across that cove was not that. He said it was doing what he was doing. He said they had looked at each other. He said the distinction seemed important enough to name, even if naming it moved the conversation outside the territory that their field reports could accommodate. Roy wrote that down too. I want to talk about what we did not find as much as what we did, because the absences in our documentation are part of the picture, and because I think they have been undervalued in the limited discussions this subject has produced in the public record. We did not find any evidence of interpersonal violence. Across 16 years and 16 confirmed or probable occupation sites, the physical evidence suggested habitation and food processing and shelter construction, and nothing that suggested conflict either with humans or with each other. No fractured tool handles, no damaged structures of the kind that result from fighting or territory defense. No accumulation of bones showing perimortem trauma. For an apex predator, which by size and apparent physical capability these beings would have been classified as, the absence of violent sign was notable. Roy observed that the large social carnivores that produce the densest population of violent physical evidence, wolves for instance, are also the species with the most complex social hierarchies, and that the absence of violence in the archaeological record could indicate either a high degree of social cohesion or a low population density that made conflict over resources unnecessary. He thought both factors were probably present. We did not find any evidence of illness or injury at the sites, though that is a difficult negative to establish from physical evidence alone. There were no accumulations of plant material that Roy could identify as consistent with the kind of medicinal preparation that some indigenous cultures have left in archaeological contexts. There were no bone fragments showing healed fractures or pathological change. There were no middens of the kind that accumulate at a long-term human habitation site, where the debris of daily living builds into a record of what went wrong as well as what went right. The sites were, in this respect, almost too clean. Roy said that a site used continuously for 8 centuries should contain more evidence of the ordinary difficulty of survival than these sites showed, and that the apparent absence of this evidence was itself a data point, though what it pointed toward was harder to determine. His best interpretation was that the sites functioned as sleeping and food processing locations rather than as base camps in the human sense, and that the full range of their activity, including whatever happened when they were ill or injured, occurred elsewhere. We found no remains of any kind, no bones or other biological material that we could attribute to the beings themselves. Whatever happened to individuals when they died, it did not happen at the sites we documented, and there was no secondary deposition of remains in any location we examined across 16 years. Roy said this was consistent with what some researchers in the field had proposed, that these beings did not leave their dead where they could be found, and that the absence of skeletal evidence was not evidence of absence, but evidence of deliberate concealment, which was itself informative about the level of awareness they brought to their relationship with the human world. A species that removes its dead from locations accessible to humans is a species that understands the implications of being found. It is a species that has made a calculated decision about what to share with the world that moves around the edges of its territory. That calculation, maintained across generations at multiple sites on a large island, required a level of social and cognitive complexity that no one in the program found easy to discuss in the clinical register of the field report. We found ways to document it. We did not find adequate language for what it meant. The most significant event of the entire 17-year program happened in the winter of 1985, and it happened not in the field but in Ottawa, and I was not present for it. Gordon Fawkes called me at my apartment in Frobisher Bay on a Tuesday morning in February, which was unusual because Gordon typically communicated through the field radio on a schedule. He said that a review committee had examined the program's documentation and had concluded that the evidence collected to that point was sufficient to confirm the existence of an unclassified hominid species in the eastern Canadian Arctic, and that this conclusion had been briefed to senior officials in 3 departments of the federal government, including a minister. He said the official determination going forward was that the species existed, that the population was small and appeared stable, that it posed no threat to human communities in the area, and that the appropriate response was continued quiet documentation and the maintenance of the program's classification. He said this with the controlled neutrality he always used for significant information, and when he was done, he asked if I had any questions. I had several. The one I asked was, did the government intend to formally acknowledge the species at any point? Gordon said the determination was that formal acknowledgement would require immediate regulatory action under the species protection frameworks that existed at that time, and that those frameworks had not been designed with a species of this nature in mind, and that the legal and political implications of attempting to apply them were, in the government's view, unmanageable in the near term. He said the determination was that acknowledgement would follow at a point when the regulatory frameworks were adequate to the situation. He said the program would continue in the meantime. I asked him when he thought the frameworks would be adequate. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said he honestly did not know. I have thought about that answer many times. I think Gordon was being honest with me. Gordon was not a man who lied easily. Not because he lacked the capacity for it, but because he had spent long enough in federal service to understand that lies require maintenance that honest statements do not. And he did not want to spend energy maintaining something that was going to be difficult enough to manage on its own terms. I think he genuinely did not know when the regulatory frameworks would be adequate to the situation. And I think that particular uncertainty troubled him more than the other uncertainties the program involved, because it was the one with no manageable horizon. The others, the classification, the restricted circulation, the cover stories that kept the assessment invisible within the normal flow of DI&D activity, those had practical rationales that Gordon could articulate and defend to himself. The question of when disclosure would happen had no practical rationale. It was a question of political will that no one in the program controlled. I think he lived with that uncertainty in the same complicated way I did, and in the same way Roy did, and in the same way Frank did. None of us were comfortable with what we were part of. None of us left. I have heard in the years since that people who were involved in classified government programs of various kinds sometimes describe their participation as having been coerced, as having been structured in such a way that leaving was not a real option. I do not experience it that way. I was given sufficient information at each stage to make a reasonable assessment of what I was agreeing to, and I agreed to it. The non-disclosure agreement I signed was legally binding, but the actual reason I stayed was not legal constraint. It was the work, which is a more troubling admission than legal constraint would be, because it means the responsibility belongs entirely to me. I have spent years examining my reasons for staying, and they reduced to two things. The first was the belief, which I still partly hold, that the program's continued existence was better for the beings on the island than its absence. Because if there was no documentation, there was no information. And without information, the regulatory frameworks that would have to account for the species someday would have nothing to work from. A classified record is better than no record. An imperfect, politically constrained documentation of a real phenomenon is more useful than the alternative, which was that the phenomenon continued to be officially non-existent, while the Inuit communities who had lived alongside it for centuries continued to be the only people on the planet who held that knowledge in any organized form. I told myself this frequently. I still believe it was true. I am less certain than I once was that it was the complete truth. The second reason was simpler and less flattering. The work was significant. What we were documenting mattered in a way that exceeded any other scientific work I could have done with my career, and I was not ready to walk away from it. There is a specific variety of professional vanity that operates in scientists who have found their way to a question that nobody else has yet managed to ask with any rigor, and I had that vanity in full measure. I was one of 3 people in the world who were systematically documenting a species that science had not acknowledged, in terrain that no other researcher had thought to examine for this purpose, using methods that Roy and Frank and I were developing from scratch, because there was no existing protocol for what we were doing. The program was uniquely mine, in the way that work becomes yours when you have poured years into it. Walking away from that would have required a principle that I could articulate, but apparently not act on. I have tried to be honest about that in the years since, because I think the dishonest version of the story, the one where I was simply serving the public good within the constraints of the system, gives me too much credit and costs the truth too much clarity. The late 1980s brought political changes to the Eastern Arctic. Frobisher Bay was renamed Iqaluit in 1987, a symbol of the broader shift as the Inuit political movement towards self-governance gained momentum. The negotiations that would eventually produce Nunavut were already underway, and the question of what land and resource rights looked like under an Inuit-governed territory had real implications for a classified program operating on that land. Gordon raised this in our annual reviews with increasing seriousness. Thomas raised a different version of the same concern that summer, working with us on the Fox Peninsula after 13 years with the assessment. His English was fluent by then. No interpreter needed. He said the beings on the island were not a secret inside the communities that lived alongside them. The elders knew. The hunters knew. The knowledge had always been part of his people's understanding of this landscape. What the program was doing, he said, was taking that knowledge and sealing it inside a government file the people who had always held it could not reach, producing a scientific record that would be used to make decisions without those people being part of the process. He said he understood why Gordon had structured things as he had. He did not say it was wrong, he said it was incomplete. That conversation was part of what shifted my thinking in the final years of the program. Not shifted enough, as it turned out, but enough that the ending, when it came, produced less resistance in me than it might have earlier. I thought about what Thomas said for a long time afterward. He was not making an accusation. He had worked with us for 13 years by that point, had brought his knowledge and his relationships and his time to a program that paid him in cash from a discretionary account and gave him no official recognition and asked him to keep everything he knew inside a circle that would never grow beyond 4 people. He had done this because he believed the documentation mattered, and because he trusted the 3 of us enough to give us access to knowledge that his community had held for generations without anyone from outside asking for it, without already having decided what the answer was. He had told me in that kitchen in Pangnirtung in 1974 that he had been waiting for someone from the government to ask the question honestly. He had given his honest answer, and then he had watched that answer go into a file that his own people could never access. What he said on the Fox Peninsula was not anger. It was a precise and accurate description of what had happened and what it cost. The cost was not primarily to Thomas, though he had paid a price too. The cost was to the relationship between the knowledge and the people who held it. Indigenous knowledge of this landscape, built across generations of living alongside something that the wider world refused to acknowledge, had been taken into a government system not to be honored or protected, but to be classified and contained. The scientific legitimacy that the program produced had been extracted from the community's knowledge without returning anything to that community. Thomas had named this without drama, and the naming was more damaging to my sense of what I had been part of than anything the government had done or failed to do. I could not correct it. By 1987, when Thomas said these things, the program's structure was fixed, and its outcome was already being determined by forces that none of us inside it had much influence over. What I could do was carry the understanding forward, into the years after the program ended, into the decisions about what to say and when to say it and to whom. Thomas's observation shapes the version of this account you're hearing now, which is addressed as much to the communities on Baffin Island as to anyone else. They already know what I know. They have always known. I am not telling them anything. What I am doing, if I am doing anything useful at all, is adding one more voice to what they have always said, from a position that the wider world has historically found more credible than theirs, and acknowledging that the credibility difference is the problem, not the evidence. The assessment was terminated in the spring of 1991. Gordon told us in February, in a call that was shorter than its content warranted, the way that calls delivering decisions already made tend to be short, because there is nothing left to deliberate, and the caller does not want to provide more surface area for the kind of argument that cannot change the outcome. The official reason was a funding reallocation related to departmental restructuring. The unofficial reason was that the political landscape had changed enough that maintaining the program's classification was generating more institutional risk than its continuation justified. The documentation would be archived at a level inaccessible under normal access to information requests, and our non-disclosure agreements remained in full effect. I had known it was coming. The signs had been visible in Gordon's manner at our last annual review in Ottawa. A tightness in the way he handled the budget discussion, and a quality of finality in how he asked questions about the documentation state that suggested he was not asking to know more but because he was closing a file. I had not raised this with Roy or Frank. There was nothing useful to say before it was confirmed, and after it was confirmed there was still nothing useful to say except that we had spent 17 years on work that would not be continued, and that the beings on the island would go back to being exclusively the concern of the communities that had always known about them, which was, in a narrow accounting, exactly where they had been before we arrived. Our last field season was the summer of 1991. We spent 6 weeks completing documentation updates and leaving the monitoring infrastructure intact, closing down what we had built with the same methodical attention we had applied to building it. The monitoring stakes came out of the ground and went into storage crates that would be shipped to Ottawa and logged into the archive. The field notebooks from that final season were sealed and inventoried. The plaster casts that had accumulated in the Pangnertung station over the years were boxed and bubble wrapped and shipped under the same classification cover that had protected everything else. Roy pulled his copies of the site documentation from his filing cabinet in Edmonton and couriered them to Gordon. Frank drove to Iqaluit and delivered his field journals to a government courier service, and I drove to the Sioux 2 weeks after the last field day and put my private copies of the most significant documentation into a fireproof lockbox that I purchased at a hardware store and that has sat in my closet ever since. Gordon had instructed us to leave the physical sites exactly as we found them, which meant removing the monitoring stakes and taking our equipment, but leaving no other sign that anyone had been working there. The stone structures remained. The overhang above Pond Inlet remained. The creek mouths and the fish processing sites and the 16 locations scattered across 1,000 kilometers of island remained exactly as they had been, carrying nothing that announced the 17 years of careful attention we had given them. This was correct. It was also the most complete expression I can give you of what the program was and what it was not. It was not stewardship. It was observation. The beings on that island had never needed us there, and our departure left them precisely as they had been before we arrived. At the Pond Inlet site, Frank and Roy and I sat outside the rock overhang on our last afternoon and watched the sun move across Baffin Island. Nobody said much. There is a specific quality of silence between people who have worked together for a long time on something they cannot discuss with anyone else, and the silence among the three of us on that afternoon had that quality in full measure. We had spent 17 years in that landscape. We had documented something that science had not classified, and the government had classified and then hidden, and we were leaving it exactly as we found it, which was both appropriate and deeply insufficient. Roy said at one point that he hoped the file would be opened someday, not by us, by someone with enough political standing to force the question. The file would not age well in the sense that government embarrassments age well, because the evidence in it was the kind that grows more significant rather than less as the years pass and the absences accumulate. Nobody argued with him. Frank took a photograph of the overhang entrance with a personal camera he had brought for the purpose, not a government camera, a small 35mm he had owned since university. I do not know what became of that photograph. I have not seen it since that afternoon, but I know he took it, and I know why, and the reason was not nostalgia. Frank Vail went back to the Geological Survey after 1991 and spent the rest of his career in entirely conventional geology. He married a woman from Iqaluit in 1994, and they moved to Victoria in the early 2000s. He called occasionally over the years, not to discuss the assessment but to talk about his grandchildren, and once to tell me he had stood at a mountain viewpoint above the city and felt the wordless pull of the Arctic in his chest and suspected he would feel it for the rest of his life. He also told me during that same call that he had never stopped thinking about the figure in the cove. He said he thought about it as you think about an encounter that you cannot explain in the frameworks available to you, and that therefore stays unresolved, accumulating weight rather than fading. He said it had not diminished over 30 years. If anything, with the distance of time, it had grown more significant rather than less, because the significance was not in the initial shock of seeing it, but in what the memory implied about the nature of the world, and that implication was the kind that becomes clearer the longer you live with it. Frank died in 2019 of a stroke at 73. I spoke at his memorial and said things about his work in the North that were all true and that did not include the most significant thing he and I had shared. Roy Cheswick retired from the University of Alberta in 2004 and died of cancer in 2012. Before he died, he sent me a handwritten letter, the only written communication either of us had shared about the program since 1991. Roy believed the beings on Baffin Island were still there, still moving through the landscape with the same patience they had brought to every interaction with us, and that this gave him a quality of feeling he could not quite name. The world contained things that did not need human acknowledgement to be real. He signed it Roy, and below his name wrote a single Inuktitut phrase that Thomas had taught us both, meaning something close to, "The ones who were here before us are still here." I am the last one. Thomas passed away in 2015 in Pangnatong, surrounded by family. Frank called me when Thomas died, and we spoke for a long time about the island and about Thomas and about what he had given the program that no one else could have given it, which was the inside of the story. Thomas had not given us access to a remote landscape and helped us document a strange and significant phenomenon. He had given us the understanding that the phenomenon was not strange to the people who had always lived near it, and that our difficulty in accepting it said something about us and nothing at all about the reality of what was there. I owe that clarity to him more than to anyone else who was part of the assessment. Gordon Fawkes died of a heart attack in 2007 at his desk in Ottawa, which was exactly where Gordon would have chosen to die if anyone had asked him. He was still working as a consultant on classification policy for the federal government at 76, because classification policy was the thing Gordon understood better than anything else, and he was not ready to give it up. I sent a letter to his family and did not attend the funeral, because Gordon would not have wanted me there in any capacity that invited questions about how I knew him. Roy in 2012. Frank in 2019. Each death narrowed the circle further, and with each narrowing I felt the weight of the silence differently, as you feel a shared weight differently when fewer people are carrying it. When there were 4 of us, the weight was distributed. When there were 3 and then 2 and then 1, the arithmetic was simple and the result was not comfortable. The analysts in Ottawa, the 2 whose names I never knew, may be alive or may not be. I have no way of knowing. What I know is that I am 79 years old, and the non-disclosure agreement I signed in the spring of 1974 has no expiration clause, which means I am technically still bound by it. And I have made a decision that I have spent a long time arriving at, which is that a document signed by a young man in the spring of his life, under conditions he could not fully evaluate, does not have an infinite claim on an old man who has watched the other people inside that secret go to their graves without speaking. I made this decision gradually, in the way that important decisions are actually made, not in a single moment of clarity, but through accumulation. One conversation with myself leading to the next, each slightly further along the road than the last. The conversation started in earnest after Frank died in 2019, and it moved through the particular isolation of the years that followed, when the world went quiet in ways that gave an old man in Sault Ste. Marie more time than usual to sit on the back porch watching the river and thinking about what he owed to the people who could no longer speak, and to the beings who had never been in a position to speak on their own behalf. I sat with it for 4 years. This is the result. I want to be precise about what I am saying. I am not saying the Canadian government committed a crime. The people who made the decisions did so with genuine concern for consequences they could not fully predict, and some of those concerns were legitimate. I am not saying the Inuit communities were wronged by something the program created, because their situation, living alongside beings the wider Canadian public has never acknowledged, predates the program by centuries. I am saying that the classification of this information was a choice that came with costs, and that those costs were paid most heavily by the beings on the island, who remain unprotected by any regulatory framework because they remain officially non-existent, and by the communities who have always known they exist, whose knowledge has been excluded from the formal record in which scientific and governmental decisions are made. I am saying that there is a file in Ottawa that does not officially exist, containing 17 years of systematic documentation of a species the government has been aware of since at least the 1970s. Plaster casts, photographs, radiocarbon dates from occupation sites, Roy's morphological analysis, several hundred field reports constituting what would, in any other context, be a significant body of primary evidence. The file exists. The beings exist. The 800 years in the rock above Pond Inlet exist. None of that requires my confirmation, or the government's, or anyone's. What I am telling you for the first time, after more than 30 years of silence, is what I saw and what I documented and what the government chose to do with it. I am telling you because the people I worked beside cannot tell you anymore, and because Thomas Akirik's communities have carried this knowledge in their own way for centuries without needing the government's file to validate it, and because I think the weight of a secret has a lifespan and this one has exceeded mine. There are things I still will not tell you. I will not give the specific grid references for the confirmed occupation sites, because those locations are active and what the attention of the public internet would do to them is not a risk I can take. I will not identify the Ottawa analysts because I genuinely never knew their names. I will not tell you the archive's classification level because that information could endanger people still in federal service. What I will tell you is this. The summer of my last field season on the island, in August of 1991, in the valley northeast of Pangnirtung where I had stood at my monitoring stakes 9 years earlier and been examined from the ridge above, I went back to that valley, alone, on the second to last day of our time on the island. I did not tell Frank or Roy I was going. I told them I was checking the final monitoring stakes at a nearby site. I hiked up the valley in the early morning, the low sun cutting horizontally across the tundra, the river running cold and clear beside me, and I walked to the place where the monitoring stakes had been and stopped. I stood there for the better part of an hour. The valley was quiet in the way Arctic valleys in summer are quiet, a quiet with texture and depth, the river sounds marking the edges of it rather than filling it. I was aware of the ridge above me the same way I had been aware of it in 1982, not through sight or sound, but through some combination of smell and a quality in the air that I had learned over 17 years to recognize. I did not see anything. I did not hear anything clearly distinct from the river and the wind. But I stayed there for an hour because I needed to be in that place one more time, in the specific landscape where I had felt most clearly the reality of what we had spent 17 years trying to document, and I needed to speak out loud, even if only to the valley and whatever was in it. The smell came after about 40 minutes. I had almost given up expecting it. It arrived the same way it had in 1982. Without wind to carry it, simply present in the air around me at a threshold below the level where I might have dismissed it as imagination. I had 17 years of reference for that smell by then, and I would not have dismissed it. But it was faint, present at the edge of perception rather than at the center of it. And I understood this as the appropriate version of a response to a visitor who had announced his departure. I was being acknowledged at a remove. I was being given enough to know that the acknowledgement was real, without being given enough to feel that I had earned more than that. Which was correct. I had earned the documentation, I had not earned the relationship. I did not turn toward the ridge. I stayed facing the river and the opposite valley wall, and I spoke into the valley, clearly but without shouting, and I said that I had been coming here for a long time and was leaving now, and that what I had documented would be kept carefully, and that I believed it would matter someday, and that I was sorry the someday had not arrived yet. I said this knowing that the words themselves were probably not the vehicle of communication, that if anything in that valley was attending to me, it was attending to the tone and the intent, rather than the specific English syntax. I had spent 17 years learning this from Thomas, who had spent his life learning it from the landscape. The language that mattered was older than any language. The smell intensified slightly when I finished speaking, and then it began to dissipate, slowly and with the same evenness with which it had arrived, and I understood that the conversation, such as it was concluded. The valley held its breath for a moment, the way valleys sometimes do when the wind shifts. And then the wind came back off the ridge, and the river ran, and the light moved across the tundra the way it always had and always would. And I turned and walked back down to the fjord. My notes from that hour, which I had been attempting to maintain out of professional habit, were mostly illegible for reasons I did not need to examine too closely. I flew out of Pangnirtung the following morning on the 7 o'clock Twin Otter to Iqaluit, and from Iqaluit I boarded a First Air turboprop to Ottawa, and from Ottawa I rented a car and drove 4 hours to Sault Ste. Marie, arriving at the house I had bought the previous year in late afternoon with the St. Mary's River visible from the back porch and the sound of the city around me after 3 months on an island where the loudest regular sound was the wind off the ice cap. The transition from the Arctic to the South is always abrupt in a way that does not become less abrupt with repetition. The sounds and the density and the smell of a city after months in that landscape have a quality of overwhelming that you manage rather than avoid. And for several days after each return, I walked through my routines with a slight sense of displacement that I never fully found a word for. I looked out the window of the Twin Otter as it climbed and banked north over the fjord, and I could see the valley receding below me, and the ridges above it, and the penny ice cap in the distance, white and enormous and unchanged by anything that had happened in or around it during my 17 years on that island. The fjord below was still open water in early August, the summer melt having cleared the sea ice weeks earlier, and the light on the water was the particular clear light of a cloudless August morning in that country, sharp and horizontal and revealing every texture in the rock faces that rose from the shoreline. I had looked at that landscape from the air dozens of times over 17 years, on the way in and on the way out, and I had never found it less than arresting. The scale of it is what does not translate in any medium. The fiords are so deep and the ridges so high and the ice caps so wide that the human presence in the communities along the shore registers as a detail rather than a feature. Small clusters of buildings at the edge of something that has no interest in being domesticated. I thought about Thomas saying that the beings there were old in the sense that the landscape itself was old, and that this was their homeland in the sense that the word homeland means something with roots so deep that no external event can relocate them. I had been thinking about that statement for years by then, turning it over the way you turn over a phrase that does not quite resolve into something you can set down and walk away from. Thomas had not been speaking poetically. He was a practical man who chose his words with the economy of someone for whom language served a function rather than an atmosphere. And when he said old in the sense of the landscape, he meant that the relationship between the beings and the terrain they occupied had passed the point at which it could be described as habitation and had entered the territory of something more like identity. The way a rock formation is part of a landscape not because it chose to be there, but because it has been there long enough that the landscape has organized itself around it. The way removing it would not leave an empty space, but would leave a shape, an absence with the contours of what had been there. I carried that idea south with me, along with the field notes and the plaster casts I had been authorized to transport and the weight of the agreement I had made and honored for 17 years. The Twin Otter banked east toward Iqaluit, and the valley was gone, and I watched the ice cap until the cloud layer closed over it, and then there was nothing but gray above and gray below, and the sound of the engines at cruise power, and the particular sensation of moving between one world and another that I had felt every time I had made this journey, and that never became ordinary. I do not know the current status of what was on Baffin Island when I left. I have kept enough peripheral attention on the place to know that there have been no public developments, no accidental discoveries, no incidents reported through any channel I can access that would suggest the population has been exposed or disturbed. The island is still largely what it was. The interior is still among the least surveyed terrain in the country. Nunavut is self-governing now, and the Inuit communities that have always held knowledge of these beings are in a position of greater political standing than they were when the program began. I take some very small comfort in that, though it does not address the specific failure of acknowledgement that the classified archive represents. There are things I have noticed over the years that are easier to state now than they would have been during the program. The Eastern Arctic has experienced significant ecological changes since 1991. The sea ice duration has shortened. The permafrost is degrading in ways that alter drainage patterns and shift the seasonal rhythms of the landscape. The char runs are smaller in some years than they were when I was documenting them. The coastal habitats are changing in ways that would affect any species dependent on them. I do not know how these changes have affected the population on Baffin Island. I do not know if the diet flexibility we observed, the tight dependence on aquatic food sources, represents an asset or a vulnerability in a changing environment. I do not know if the population is stable, growing, contracting, or shifting its range in response to conditions that are themselves shifting. These are questions that the program would have been positioned to investigate if it had continued, or if the existence of the population had been formally acknowledged and included in the wildlife management frameworks that govern the Canadian Arctic. They are questions that nobody in any official capacity is investigating, because the species is not officially there. Whatever is happening on Baffin Island is happening without monitoring, without protection, without any institutional awareness that it matters. That gap between what we documented and what the current management frameworks account for is not an abstraction. It has consequences that I cannot calculate, but that concern me in the same specific way that any gap between evidence and institutional response concerns a scientist who has spent a career on the evidence side of that gap. I raise this not to alarm, but to be accurate. The classified archive in Ottawa contains a body of evidence about a species in a particular ecosystem. That ecosystem is changing. The species does not know the archive exists. The archive cannot protect the species from anything. What would protect the species is acknowledgement. And acknowledgement requires the kind of political will that has not been present for 50 years and that I have no particular reason to expect will arrive soon. I say this plainly because plainness is what the situation calls for and what I have spent 33 years failing to provide. The world is capable of accepting things it previously refused to accept. I have watched that happen across my lifetime in domains that seemed at earlier points equally intractable. The scientific consensus on matters that were considered settled has shifted before, and not always slowly, and I hold on to the possibility that it will shift on this one too, not because I expect it to happen soon, but because I have seen enough of how knowledge moves through institutions to know that the shift, when it comes, tends to come from the accumulation of evidence that could no longer be managed rather than from a single dramatic disclosure. The evidence is accumulating. I am not the first person to have told a version of this story, and I will not be the last, and the weight of testimony eventually becomes too dense for any framework of dismissal to fully absorb. I hold on to the 8 centuries in the rock above Pond Inlet. 8 centuries is a span of time that runs backward from now through the founding of Canada as a country, through the entire period of European contact with the North American continent, through the Thule expansion that brought the ancestors of the modern Inuit across the Arctic, through all of that history, through the diseases and the disruptions and the wholesale transformation of the continent's political and ecological landscape. Whatever lives in those fiords and valleys continue to use that overhang above Eclipse Sound, continue to bring fish to the site, and process them with stone tools and sleep in bedding made from Arctic willow and sedgegrass. Continued without interruption, without documentation, without acknowledgement, and apparently without any particular need for any of those things. That continuity is the fact that I find most difficult to fully hold in my mind even now, 50 years after I first stood at a site and began to understand what the evidence was saying. I hold on to the flat gray August morning in the valley when the smell arrived without wind and the shape moved along the ridge, unhurried, and stopped above my position and looked down and made whatever calculation it made and then continued on its way. I have replayed that morning more times than I can count, in the nights when sleep has not come easily, and each time I replay it, the thing that stays with me is the absence of urgency. It did not stop above me because I was a threat to be assessed and neutralized. It stopped because I was there, and it was curious, and it had the patience to satisfy that curiosity at its own pace and its own time, without any reference to the schedule I was working on. That patience is the behavioral characteristic that stays with me more than any other. We have spent decades in the South documenting a species through accounts that emphasize size and speed and the fear response of the observers. The patience is what the accounts tend to miss, because fear is a more gripping narrative than the careful, unhurried attention of a being that has been watching this landscape from the same ridges for centuries and has learned that patience produces more information than urgency. I hold on to what Frank said that evening, that they had looked at each other, that whatever the being was doing, it was doing what he was doing. That sentence has stayed with me for 50 years and has not lost anything in the keeping. Frank was not a man given to statements he had not thought through. He had a geologist's epistemology, which means he was trained to distinguish between what the evidence showed and what he wanted it to show. And he applied that training to everything he said out loud in a professional context. The phrase was not loose. The exchange across that cove had a mutual character that was different from the one-directional quality of an animal sighting. He meant that both parties were aware of the other's awareness. He meant that whatever passed between them in those 4 minutes was not simply his observation of the being, but the being's observation of him. And that both observations were happening with a quality of attention that he could not, after several days of thinking about it carefully, distinguished from what he would call conscious recognition. That is a striking claim for a man trained in empirical field science to make. Frank knew how it would land, and he made it anyway, because he had spent 4 years on Baffin Island by the time of that sighting. And he had the intellectual honesty to report what the evidence showed, even when the evidence went somewhere uncomfortable. The field sciences select for people who can tolerate the gap between what they expected to find and what they actually found. And Frank had a higher tolerance for that gap than most. When he said the distinction seemed important enough to name, even if naming it moved the conversation outside the territory that their field reports could accommodate, he was reporting a conclusion he had already worked through on his own, during the 20 minutes he sat on the rock after the figure disappeared into the shelter before he motored back to Pangnertung. He had not come to the field station that evening with a provisional observation. He had come with a conclusion he had examined from every angle he could construct and that had not collapsed under the examination. I have held that conclusion alongside everything else we documented for 50 years. It does not prove anything in a scientific sense, but it belongs in the record, which is partly why I am putting it there now. I hold on to Ikaluk, the elder at Pond Inlet, who had stood in a dark winter valley and listened to the calls move back and forth across the distance, and who, when asked why he had not run, said simply that running from something you do not understand is not always the wise choice. He said his grandfather had taught him that. His grandfather had been taught it by someone before him. The knowledge was old enough that its origin was not traceable to a single individual or a single encounter. It was simply the understanding that a community accumulates when it has lived alongside a presence for long enough that the relationship has its own structure, its own protocols, its own accumulated wisdom about what works and what does not. The Inuit communities on Baffin Island had that understanding long before Gordon Fawkes drove to Thunder Bay to recruit a wildlife biologist. They have it still. The file in Ottawa is a recent addition to a body of knowledge that predates the country that produced it. My name is Dale Sproule. I worked for the Canadian government for 21 years, and the most significant work of those 21 years was documented in a file that does not officially exist, in an archive in Ottawa that I cannot access, under a classification that has no expiration date. I have waited 33 years to say what I have just told you, and I will tell you plainly that it does not feel like relief. It feels like the thing it is, which is an old man placing on the record a truth that a government decided should not be on the record, so that the record is more complete than it was this morning. The beings on Baffin Island are not a legend. They are not a misidentification of polar bears or musk oxen or any animal in any field guide published by any institution in this country. They are something that has lived in the eastern Arctic since before the Inuit arrived from the west, something that has built the same shelter sites for 800 years, that processes fish with stone tools, that calls across the dark winter valleys in patterns that sound, to an old man who spent 17 years listening for them, like conversation. They have no official existence. They have every other kind. I do not expect this account to change any official record. I am under no illusion about the responsiveness of governments to the testimony of a 79-year-old retired wildlife biologist telling a story that most of the scientific establishment will dismiss before finishing the second paragraph. What I expect is that the people who have already understood, for reasons of their own, that the world contains more than the official record acknowledges, will recognize what I am describing. And I expect that the communities on Baffin Island, the Inuit hunters and elders who have held this knowledge in their own way for 1,000 years, will understand that someone from the outside finally said it plainly. That is enough. That has to be enough. The valley northeast of Pangnertung is still there. The ridge above it is still there. The Penny ice cap is still there. And what moves along those ridges in the long summer light and shelters in those rock overhangs through the dark winter months is still there too, conducting its ancient, unhurried business in the oldest homeland on the island, as it was when Gordon Fawkes chose me and sent me north, and as it will be when there is no one left alive who was ever part of a classified program that the government of Canada still says never existed. I know differently. Roy knew, Frank knew, Gordon knew, Thomas knew, and his father before him and his father's father before that. The ones who were here before us are still here.